are watching Simon Says on Mtgo Academy featuring Simon Götzen.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to another episode of Simon Says. I'm going to bring you another M15 draft, but I do want to talk about a little topic that has been on my mind basically ever since we started drafting the core set again. And the topic is colors and color commitment in limited in drafting, with the base set having its own rules, and that's especially important as we are gearing up to draft Khans of Tarkir, which will have a lot more complicated color commitment rules than the relatively straightforward single-colored base set. I think a wedge shard is going to be quite the challenge in the beginning. How do you position yourself in your colors, and how do you actually read signals in that realm? But we are currently still drafting M15, and I have taken the liberty to just go ahead with my drafts, with my previous drafts, and look at what I did there. And this isn't going to be a really long-winded analysis, but I just want to highlight some of the concepts. Now, this is the very first M15 draft that I recorded, and I didn't do many drafts before that, so I know now that the drafting was actually pretty bad. For example, this first pick here, I definitely should have just taken the Spirit Bonds, and even Kurt Chieftain is better than Chasm Skulker. But I did take the Chasm Skulker, but this picture is just here to show you that I passed the Kurt Chieftain. And then the next pack has another Kurt Chieftain right there. So this is pretty much the first rule that I want to touch upon. And that being that it's much more important what your right neighbor wants you to draft than what your left neighbor thinks of you. So even though I just passed the Kurt Chieftain, I'm not somebody who would advise to not pick a powerful Ankam if it's passed to you. I think that Kurt Chieftain is actually still very good. I thought it was very good when I did this draft, and I think it's probably even better than I rated it at that point. So I think that Kurt Chieftain here is clearly the best pick, even if it's not super likely that both of my first picks will go together in the same deck. It's just that much stronger than Covenant of Blood, that I don't think it's a close pick here. So this draft develops quite interestingly. This pack has pretty much only the choice between Roaring Primodox and Netcaster Spider. In theory, you could pick the Constricting Sliver, but you already have a tendency towards green with the Chieftain. And I'm actually not sure if nowadays I would pick the Primodox rather than the Spider, because I think the Spider is actually great and the Primodox doesn't do all that much. At least doesn't offer as much of an advantage as it looks like. But nevertheless, I pick a green card here, which I'm happy about. And then this pick comes around. Now, this pick is a pretty bad, objectively speaking, but it highlights an interesting concept. And the fact of the matter is that I picked Necromancer's Stockpile. Now, in retrospect, that card is just not good enough to consider here. But I didn't know that at that time. And it's a rare, so I want to try to play with the rarer cards in the beginning of the format. But this isn't about me excusing this pick. It's really just about showcasing the point here. For example, if this wasn't a Necromancer Stockpile, but a card that was actually good, like a Covenant of Blood, I would still pick it rather than going for a mediocre blue card, a mediocre green card, or maybe even a mediocre red card. So what the point I'm trying to make is that by pick 4, you are still not committed to your colors, and it's not intrinsically bad to still branch out or to continue surfing the waves, as we say, surfing in the sense that we are still trying to feel which kind of colors we should be drafting. And I think that's something that you can actually practice in core set drafts very well because of the single colored nature of cards, and really most of the time the power level of cards mattering rather than some kind of synergy or curve based decks. Now, as you can see, Kurt Chieftain is an exception to this rule because it is effectively a gold card, but that's also why this draft was a bit more challenging with the first big chieftain and the second big chieftain, leading me in a pretty tough spot. So I picked the stockpile here, and only then actually this pack is not really a good example. I still get past packs that don't really push me in any direction. All of these cards are pretty much exchangeable. There's another Titanic Growth, there's an Encrust, there's a Krenko's Enforcer. Just some cards. They happen to be in my colors. I see that there is no white, so I thankfully don't have to draft a fifth color. But yeah, I just pick an Encrust here, and I'm still very open to what to draft. And then suddenly, and we're talking about pick 6 here, there's a Frostlings in the pack. So even though I wasn't sure that I could be drafting blue after that first pick Chasm Skulker, it just didn't have to be open. That is a pretty nice gift and a pretty nice sign that blue is open. So I'm happy to pick that up. And look at that, there's a Satyr Wayfinder in the pack, which I like a lot, and I like even better now. I think it's actually a key card to have in green decks. It allows for a lot of different archetypes to work. But suddenly, we have, by waiting effectively, we have been able to more or less deduce that blue-green is an open archetype here. Now, that fit quite well into our first 3 picks, and that black card was just straying off the path. But if this is not a Satyr Wayfinder but a Covenant of Blood, then I might actually end up in blue-black, because that's the colors that are open. So this is the final result. If you've watched my videos, you might remember this deck. With, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks between this draft and the one I'm going to show you, there's a lot of things that I would do differently. I think I drafted this deck with the knowledge of previous core sets, which were very grindy and late gamey. And looking at some of my card choices, or for example this main deck Grind Clock, I was quite optimistic, and also nowadays I usually don't end up with too many Encrusts in my deck, but that's not the point. I still think that this is already a great example of how not to commit to a color too early, and to really force yourself to read the signals. Although I don't love that term. So it's less about like one clear signal, but more about the later in the draft, the more information the packs give you, and you build a picture from each of these information bits. So, well, this draft was kind of interesting because the packs were actually quite weak. Pack, I don't know, 3 to 6 weren't very impressive. So that's not generally then the picks aren't all that difficult, because you can't do much wrong. So let's go to the next draft, which starts with a Stoke the Flames, and then somebody passes me a Triplicate Spirits. Now, there's an Inferno Fist or a Borderland Marauder in the pack, also a Devouring Light, Constricting Sliver, but there's just no reason on earth to not pick that Triplicate Spirits. If my opponent to the right picks a rare and passes me Triplicate Spirits, I'm taking it. It's basically an unwritten rule. My opponent to the right also knows that I'm going to take it, and I'm going to be cutting white if possible, so that the cards I'm passing here don't really matter. And I'm just shooting myself in the foot if I take Inferno Fist or Borderland Marauder here because of my first pick. But I think that is pretty obvious. Most people are not hesitant to pick up the card in a second color if it's stronger than the alternatives, and Triplicate Spirits is pretty much the prime example for that. So what happens next? I'm getting this pack, and once again we have a drop in quality, but this time I would say the options are probably between Wall of Frost, Forge Devil, and Raise the Alarm. So 2 of these 3 options are in color, and both Forge Devil and Raise the Alarm work really, really well with the 2 cards that I've picked first. Now, this is the second point that I want to touch upon, the second main point, and that is I have more information about white being open than about red being open. In fact, I first picked the Stoke the Flames, so that pick gave me 0 information about red being open. So all I'm counting on is that this Forge Devil might be a signal that red is open, which is a very weak signal, and that's why I like the concept of how much information do I have about this color being open, and well, to be honest, in red, I have almost zero information because my neighbor could have easily picked a red card here. On the other hand, the second pick, Triplicate Spirits, makes it a lot more likely that white is open. There is these corner cases where somebody picks a right rare instead of Triplicate Spirits first pick, but still, if I get past the best white common, I just have to assume that the chances that white is open to the right are much higher than not. Also, white being one of the best colors in the format is actually worth fighting for. So I think that Raise the Alarm here is the clear front runner as the correct pick, and that's what I take. And the argument basically continues now that I see packs that have, for example, Sunrise Pegasus, Pillar of Light, but also powerful other cards in the form of Netcaster Spider. It's still correct to continue drafting white cards. If I get the chance to draft the best color in the format, and I get the feeling that this is in accordance with what my neighbor wants me to do, then I see no reason to stray from the path. So there is no intrinsic value to diversifying your colors if it's not necessary. All right, this pack develops quite nicely for me. I just pick up a lot of white cards, and at some point there is an Into the Void. Now if we count, that is actually an 8th pick Into the Void, which I think is very late. So clearly I picked this up. There isn't even a white or red card to really consider here, and taking Oppressive Raise would just leave me without an Into the Void if I end up in blue-white, which is certainly an option with the cards I have here. Stoke the Flames, I've seen only the first pick, so I basically have to assume that red is not open at this point, which means that the fact that I have a red card actually means it's less likely than that I'm going to be playing red, because I only have a single red card. However, this all changes when I get a Broodkeeper in pack 2, and I then decide that Broodkeeper with the 2 Heliod's Pilgrims and the 1 Stoke the Flames that I have is just going to be stronger than the blue cards that I currently have, which is basically Into the Void and an awkward Encrust that is good with the Pilgrims but bad on the mana. So this Broodkeeper makes me think that the power level of these uncommons and the fact that I will only need a few red cards because white is wide open is going to be the way to go. And that's pretty much the story of this draft. I end up with 6 red cards. I like Rummaging Goblin a lot. All the other cards are pretty much self-explanatory. I guess playing Crowd's Favor wasn't entirely necessary. You could have easily played the Kinspelled Skirmisher here, but I think you get the idea. Also, I mean, the double Sunrise Pegasus, double Soulmender, Ajani's Pride mid deck is a very nice deck all in itself. All right, so the lesson here was that it was pretty much the core of signaling. If you get a Triplicate Spirit second, you have to assume that your neighbor wants you to be in white and take advantage of that. All right, this is a pack. This is the draft number 3 where I actually start with the Triplicate Spirits myself, and the best card in the pack is Hoarding Dragon, no questions asked. So this draft actually looks like it's a repeat from draft 2 that we've seen, where we also ended up in a Triplicate Spirits Hoarding Dragon white-red deck after picking a lot of white cards and a Stoke of Flame. But what happens next is pretty much my main motivation for doing this intro. There is an Oreska Swiftclaw, there is a Heliod's Pilgrim, there is no red card in the pack. I mean, Foundry Street Denizen doesn't really count. But there is, well, overall there's a pretty low quality of cards. I definitely overrated Turn the Frog here, also because of my experience with older formats where Turn the Frog was a lot better. At this point, I'm not sure if Turn the Frog is actually better than Oreska Swiftclaw, and I wouldn't fault anybody for taking the Swiftclaw. I think it's the most straightforward pick here. But as I've said earlier, it's not really the point if this pick was correct or not. It's just the point that if there now is a powerful blue card in the pack, at least that's my philosophy in drafting, I just take it because I have very little information about white being open. Oreska Swiftclaw, while a solid card, is definitely not in the top 3 commons in white. So if we take that for granted, then as before, I don't have that information that white is open. If you look at this pack, the fact that there's a Wall of Essence here or Heliod's Pilgrim doesn't tell me anything. There's an uncommon missing, so it could be anything. In fact, if the uncommon was still there, it could easily be the case that my right neighbor took a Triplicate Spirits himself, which is kind of the worst case scenario. Now, what I do comment on here at this point is that there might also be a Cone of Flame missing, because that's one of the most powerful uncommons in the format, and one that you would pass a Hoarding Dragon for. The fact that we get such a powerful second pick is actually a signal in itself, because it significantly reduces the space of cards that this slot could have occupied. Alright, so I take Turn of Rock here, and then this pack comes around. It has a Dauntless River Marshal, which is great, because we have a Triplicate Spirits and a Turn of Rock. White might actually be open. Just a great pickup out of an otherwise a bad pack. No red cards to be seen, by the way, making me more and more certain that my right neighbor might be on a Cone of Flame first pick. So this trend continues, with the best white card here being once again Heliod's Pilgrim. I think that's generally better than Ephemeral Shield, at least early in the draft. So if you listen carefully, you should be able to deduce what I pick here. And, well, the secret to this is, of course, that it's not a white card, it's not a red card, and it's not a blue card either. The best two cards in this pack are probably Venom Sliver and Covenant of Blood, although I'm not a big fan of the small Death Touchers with so many small creatures running around. Covenant of Blood, on the other hand, is really, really nice if you just get basically any black deck with a bunch of creatures, maybe the black-green deck, but also black-blue evasion. It doesn't really matter. Covenant of Blood is just a very solid removal spell that can also help burn people out. So a quick check with the cards I have reveals that if I pick the Covenant of Blood, it might be going into a white-black deck, it might be going into a blue-black deck, it might be going into a black-red deck. It also means that I'm very certainly not playing all of the cards I've drafted. I'm pretty much guaranteed. However, the upside of picking a strong black card here is just higher than picking a mediocre white card that I'm more likely to play, but even that's not true. For example, in the case of Hoarding Dragon, I almost have to assume that red is not open from what I've seen. So picking a mediocre red card actually leads me into this trap of drafting a color that's not really open. So this is how the draft continues. I actually pick up a Welkin turn here, and just looking at or it might be that I pick a Gargoyle Sentinel. I actually don't remember exactly. Gargoyle Sentinel would make sense with that many colors drafted at this point. But just looking at this pack, I think it's pretty clear that a green is not open and white is not really open, because the white cards are just not on the power level that you would expect from white cards. So yeah, actually I think that I took the Welkin turn, which was quite ambitious. But just to show you how this developed, and of course if you watched the video you know how it developed, I pretty much end up picking only black and blue cards from this point on. I get an Into the Void, which I'm a big fan of, and at this point I pretty much know that Hoarding Dragon is not going to happen, even though I picked up a Krankos Enforcer as well. So ultimately, I end up in this pretty sweet blue-black deck. 2 Jerubai Murklurkers, an Indulgent Tormentor, 3 Flesh to Dust, 1 Aether Spout. So all of these cards come later in the draft, and I ultimately decide to only board in the Covenant of Blood. If you watched the last draft and also the intro that I did, I talk a lot about sideboarding in that video, and how you can build your deck to be aggressive or control, or maybe a hybrid of both, and then you can compensate for certain weaknesses in the sideboarding process. So I think this is just it's an incredible deck, but the story of the draft is even more incredible. Start with the Triplicate Spirits, which is here. Then pick a Hoarding Dragon, which is here. And only because I pick a Turn to Frog and I'm open to picking a Covenant of Blood, I open up the possibility of going for a blue-black draft, which, as we see later, protects me from the red-green draft on my right that has first picked the Cone of Flame, and also makes it possible for me to leave the overdrafted white color in this draft. So I almost talked about color preference and the color commitment in my last intro, but then I kind of had to talk about sideboarding. But this is just something that I didn't want you to miss. All right. This concludes the opening discussion, the intro for this episode. And I do have one final comment, and that's something which I feel is a bit lacking in M15. There's a couple of fringe strategies in the format that you can go for, but sadly, I rarely see them succeed. That might be because of the aggressiveness of the format, or because of the fact that everybody is just trying to beat you down with small creatures. So if you stumble, you just die quite quickly. I haven't quite figured it out. It's just kind of sad that, for example, the blue-red artifact deck, or even the black-green self-mill deck, don't really work out in a strong way as often as I would like. However, there is hope. And that hope comes in the face of this 5-color sliver deck. Now, this is not my creation, but I just want to show you what it has. Of course, this is from a real life draft. 2 sliver hives with a venom sliver and 2 sliver hive lords, a constricting sliver. To actually cast the slivers, there's 2 verdant havens, a Shivan Reef, a Yavimaya Coast, and a Lanoa Wastes. And the rest of the deck is pretty ambitious as well. 2 Sign-in Bloods, 2 Verdant Havens, 2 Covenant of Bloods, in Garruk's Wake, a Resolute Archangel. This deck is all over the place, and I have to say I absolutely love it. It reminds me of my M14 PDQ winning deck, where I just had the Bogbrew Ridge combo and Primeval Bounty, and I don't know, I think 1 or 2 corrupts. It was just absolutely beautiful. But this is on another level, and now you might say, well, this is a fun deck to draft at FNM or whatever, but this is actually Germany's PDQ winning deck from the last MCQ weekend. So the guy won, I'm sorry, I don't know his name, went into PDQ Berlin, top 8 draft with a bunch of great players, and he said, well, I'm going to draft the sliver deck. I don't know at which point he decided it, but I just have the utmost respect for going for that in such a high pressure situation and actually believing in what your deck and you are capable of. With that, I will leave you to the rest of this episode. Enjoy the show. Let me know in the comments what kind of nice fringe archetypes you've discovered in M15. And I hope you're getting hyped for Khans of Tarkir. I know I am. See you next time.
If you'd like to exchange your Magic Online cards for event tickets while logged in on Magic Online, you can do so by trading Mtgo Academy's official bot, Academy Buy Bot. You can find it in the Magic Online trading area or add it to your buddy list.
Hello everyone, it's time to draft M15 once again. The 4th time, if I'm counting correctly here. I'm trying out something new where I have the color sorting activated, so we can actually see that Return to the Ranks is the rare. There's also an Urborg as the foil rare in the pack, both of which aren't really first picks in my book. There's a Constricting Sliver, which I like quite a bit, even though it costs 6. Frostlings is very powerful in the Tempo blue decks, and the only other card I'm really considering would be Siege Worm, although I also like the versatility and, well, impact of Living Totem. I think the best pick here is Frostlings, very good on the curve. I do like blue. It might not be the best color in this format, but you can definitely build some good decks around it. Alright, so this might be a bit confusing now with the rarities, but Stain the Mind is the rare, Sunblade Elf is the first uncommon, and Dissipate is the second, so we can deduce that there's an uncommon missing from this pack. And this gives us a pretty good idea of how the colors are flowing, and that, at least that's the idea. A Curse Spirit is good, Dissipate is solid, and we already have a blue card. And then there's Sunblade Elf, which I think is better than the 2 other cards. It doesn't work as well in conjunction with Frostlings, so you would have to be blue-green splashing white or blue-white splashing green to make it work. I generally want to pick the highest powered card after my first pick, and pretty much irrespective of the color. I think that Sunblade Elf is sufficiently better than all the alternatives here. Although, looking at these 4 blue cards, all of them are pretty sweet. So if one of them was better than Sunblade Elf, I would definitely be happy to take it after the first pick, Frostlings. Alright, still no white cards, the second Marked by Honor that we see here. And Soul Artifact, which I'm not too keen on picking up early. Even with a blue card, it's not clear that you would go into a blue artifact themed deck. And in my experience, you really want to be blue-red for that. And even then, the Soul Artifact strategy does not really work out all that much. I like Peel from Reality. It's quite a solid card. It also works very well with Frostlings and lots of other blue cards. I like Crippling Blight. And that pretty much concludes the pack. Another weak pack, I think. You could gamble here and take the Install Artifact, kind of with the intention of going for a bit more of a gimmicky deck. You could go for the Research Assistant if you knew that you were going to be a control deck, but my first 2 picks don't look that way at all, so I value Peel from Reality higher than Research Assistant or Crippling Blight, which are the more defensive options. Although Crippling Blight is quite good in this format. Although, well, Darkseid Citadel, for the person that snatches up the Install Artifact, I guess, that's definitely a combo that you want to assemble in this limited format at least once. So let's look at the pack. There is an Ulcerate, Darkseid Citadel as uncommons, rare, and one of the uncommons already gone. Raise the Alarm is solid, but I've grown to like it a bit less because the really strong white decks usually don't come together. Also, from what I've seen, I don't think that white is open in this particular draft. There's Coral Barrier, solid blue card. Reclamation Sage, pretty good. Oh, actually the third uncommon, I'm sorry. Reclamation Sage, a great green card, and Ulcerate as a removal option. I like Ulcerate here the best. I think the alternatives are Forge Devil, Coral Barrier, and Reclamation Sage. But getting past a 4th pick, 1 mana removal spell is a pretty good sign that black is open, so I'm happy to take that. Even though blue-black control, or at least blue-black, is a bit more control-ish than the cards Peel from Reality and Frostlings want to be, it's still early enough to switch strategies here. More black cards, all solid, so I would take Sign and Blood over the 2 alternatives. I rarely play Blood Host. There's Forge Devil, but also more and more blue cards coming. Coral Barrier, Nimbus of the Elves, and Jace's Ingenuity, so a bunch of good options here. We can expect more Coral Barriers in the future, so it's one of the blue 5-drops here. And ultimately, Jace's Ingenuity is just the card that's going to have the higher impact in more games than Nimbus of the Isles. Although card draw is not as great as it's in other limited formats. Okay, looking at this Sunblade, I haven't seen white signals and nothing that really wants me to be green. Although there is a pretty nice archetype in blue-green where you just bounce your own stuff all the time and profit from it with invasive species, Shaman of Spring, Frostlings, and so on. But I don't think that is happening. Also black, after the Ulcerate and the pack with the Sign in Blood, not too much coming. I mean, Shadowcloak Vampire is fine, but not amazing. There is 2 red cards, but so far I haven't seen any red signals. So I'm just going to stick to taking a blue card to get more information. And it looks like blue at least is open, with maybe the artifact deck being open. We passed the Install Artifact. I haven't seen any Scrapyard Mongrels. I also haven't seen really the support artifacts that you are happy to play, even if your deck otherwise is just a regular limited deck. These black cards, again, solid, but I think that Welkin Turn is better than Carrion Crow. I'm not one of the people that doesn't like Welkin Turn anymore just because it's maybe a bit weaker than in other formats. It's still a great way to pull ahead in limited on turn 2. I don't want to overdo picking the Peel from Realities, and I think picking Welkin Turn over Carrion Crow is, first of all, it's the better pick, and second of all, it's important to solidify blue, whereas black is really not clear if it's going to be in my deck in the end. This looks like a Sacred Armory, which is one of the support artifacts that I was talking about. You're almost never unhappy to have a Sacred Armory in your deck. At least that's my experience. I also quite like Zoffshade, but this is a situation where I think that Zoffshade is a lot less likely to make my deck than the Sacred Armory is. Also, if I end up moving into an artifact themed deck, then I'm happy about every good artifact that I've picked up to this point. Here, Statue of Denial does not come close to the power level of Carrion Crow, so I think that's a pretty easy pick. We can always get 3 Toughness Defenders later, so I'm taking the Crow. Research Assistant and Dissipate wheeling out of the pack with that had the Peel from Reality, and I believe the Ensoul artifact as well, so that's a good sign. And I'm not exactly sure which card I want here. Dissipate is the rarer of the two, and that definitely impacts my decision. I also have a Jace's Ingenuity already, Peel from Reality, so I'll have a lot of options to keep my mana open, which makes the counter magic superior, I think. Invisibility is not a card I want to play, and none of these really excite me. I'm going to take the Verdant Haven just for the off chance that we end up in green after all. Here, that's a pretty late Zoffshade, and we have the Carrion Crow now, so I'm going to keep taking black cards. I think it's very unlikely that we are going to end up in red. Even the artifact deck doesn't seem to be there, so I'm happy to pass the Hammer Hand to somebody else. Interesting late pick in Eternal Thirst. Actually a card that I think is a lot closer to playable than most people make it out to be. It's a card that really looks like a junky last pick, and people playing it will run into card disadvantage. But I've played against it, and sometimes it's quite threatening how easily the creature grows and puts on pressure. So here I like the green cards, Gather Courage and Shaman of Spring, but looking at my colors, and my colors are definitely blue and black at this point, there's Carrion Crow, Typhoid Rats, Amphin Pathmage, and Void Snare. I'm not somebody to pick Void Snare early with Peel from Reality already in my pack, also Frostlings to punish heavy aura strategies. I have an Amphin Pathmage already, and also I'm not the biggest fan of it. And Typhoid Rats has really dropped in my evaluation. In other formats, having a 1/1 Death Touch creature is amazing because it acts as a removal spell, as a virtual removal spell. In this format, there's so many 1 Toughness creatures that you are almost forced to trade your Death Touch creature for something small, and I really don't like that. So I'm taking Carrion Crow as another evasive flyer here. And there's Frostlings, but there's also Jerube Merc Lurker, which is the better card if you are in blue-black. And gambling for the fact that this might wheel, I think is too ambitious. Also Frostlings, Necromancer's Assistant, and Rod Feaster Maggot, all cards that I would be happy to play. This pack is pretty stacked anyway. Satyr Wayfinder, Siege Worm are pretty good. Kinspell Skirmisher, Pillar of Light are solid. And I like Crowd's Favor and Fair Incarnation even. So yeah, pretty good pack. For us, it's the blue-black card, I think. That's really... I think it's clearly better than the Frostlings, so I'm taking it. And from this point on, I'm really set into blue-black. There isn't much that's going to stop me from being blue-black. And interestingly, the blue-black deck I'm drafting currently looks quite tempo-y, which makes especially the Jace's Ingenuity a bit weaker than I would like it to be, but I think that's going to be acceptable. There's a Shield of the Avatar, which I like quite a bit, but not in such an evasive deck. You really don't need Shield of the Avatar in a Welkin turn strategy. The most solid pick here is Coral Barrier, followed by Witch's Familiar, and I personally like Feast on the Fallen quite a bit, given that I have a Welkin turn, Frostlings, double Carrion Crow. It is early enough in the pack that it might actually wheel, so I'm gonna have a look out for that. And overall, Coral Barrier has to be a bit stronger than Witch's Familiar. It's actually not by much, but it is the stronger card. And there's a Military Intelligence, which kind of fits into the same theme as Feast on the Fallen, but it works a bit. It's a bit more complicated to make work. So you're more all in on your strategy, and you also want more cheap creatures and maybe raise the alarms to make it work. I'm going to take Sign in Blood here. I'm not super happy about it, and I might not even play it, but it's still far superior to Mind Rot, which I generally don't play. So here, I think picking up a Fester Gloom is a smart choice. I have a Welkin Turn and a Coral Barrier token that dies to it, but otherwise it's going to be an amazing card against white and against Triplicate Spirits, one of the best cards in the format. So there's no reason to take a 6-drop over it, even if Fester Gloom should end up in the sideboard. This is interesting. I already talked about Military Intelligence. There's also another Sign in Blood and an Aeronaut Tinkerer. Now, I've passed on the 2/3 Toad, I think at least twice now, but the Tinkerer fills that role perfectly, as it has an advantage if we draw the Sacred Armory, and we might even want to play the Blue Paragon if the draft continues like it looks like. So I don't want another Sign in Blood. I'm not even sure about the first one, but I'm happy about the first Tinkerer here. Alright, a bunch of divinations, but also a Shadow Cloak Vampire, which I have a lot of respect for. And given that I'm already unsure about the Sign in Blood, which fits into the curve a lot better, I'm going to take Shadow Cloak Vampire over another card draw spell. My deck currently doesn't really have a lot of ways to get back tempo, so you really want to curve out rather than playing card draw spells. Here the option is to pick a second Fester Gloom or a second Amphin Path Mage, which would actually look pretty good in the main deck. Even if you don't activate it, it's a solid 3/2 for 4, and if you do, it's actually quite threatening for your opponent. I'm just wondering if I want another Fester Gloom, but this is really not looking like a deck that wants to main deck Fester Gloom. If it was blue-black control in a more traditional sense, then I would definitely go for Fester Gloom. And also, I really don't like the Golem. Not in this kind of deck that really wants to tap its creatures to attack for 2 and not play a fat ground creature for a little bit of a discount. Fugitive Wizard would actually be, in theory, a sideboard card against white as well. But I have the Fester Gloom, and Void Snare punishes the white decks as well, especially when they try to play too many auras. Alright, none of these cards are interesting. I guess I take the on-color card. Crowd's Favor, Aggressive Mining, First Response. None of these are too threatening for me. Alright, I'm going to take the Feast on the Fallen here. I still can decide if I want to run it, but it could actually work out in this deck quite nicely. Like, it's actually great with Carrion Crow and Welkin Turn. Alright, I'm not gonna run this, so I'm gonna hate draft the Solemn Offering. More Eternal Thirst, who knows, maybe as a sideboard option. This is another thing, if your opponent is just playing a very aggressive deck, then you have a cheeky way of stealing games with lifelink, and if your opponent doesn't have a lot of removal, even the triggers are pile up very quickly. Time for the final pack, and in another universe I would be very happy to pick Wall of Frost here, a card I really like in the blue-black control decks. I also love Crippling Blight as a very cheap way of dealing with most of the early game creatures in the format. I have a feeling that I should be taking Welkin Turn here, because my overall strategy is just leaning on cheap evasive threats, and Welkin Turn is perfect for that. Crippling Blight is fine, and I would be happy to run one, but Welkin Turn is going to make this whole deck better. Also looking at cards like Sacred Armory, Feast on the Fallen, and so on. Not much else to say here. Goblin Kaboomus is in the pack, Roaring Primadox. Some of these cards might wheel. Wall of Frost, Crippling Blight, Black Cat, all solid. And I probably would only want the Crippling Blight, to be honest. Interesting. This is my shot at Welkin Turn number 3, Peel from Reality number 2, a Typhoid Rats or a Fester Gloom. Even a Caustic Tar is in the pack, but that's a very expensive card to finish games. I think the Caustic Tar is most likely to wheel out of this pack also. Now, if I pick up the third Welkin Turn, I'm just not going to be a Fester Gloom deck, and that makes the most sense. I don't want the Typhoid Rats at this point. I might want them on the wheel if they come around. I'm also happy about a second Peel from Reality, but given that I only have the single Frostlings, it's not that high of a priority. So I also don't have too many 1-drops, so Peel is a bit more clunky than I would love. Alright. Black uncommons and Covenant of Blood to choose from. Now, Stab Wound is just absolutely amazing. The same holds for Gravedigger. I recently won a draft with a double Gravedigger deck, where at some point you just start recurring Gravediggers, giving you an internal blocker, and still the late game option to recur anything you want. Covenant of Blood is also amazing at closing out games, but 7 mana is actually quite a lot, and if you have so many creatures around that it doesn't matter, you're probably winning anyway, especially with the deck that we're drafting. That said, I'm going to take Stab Wound. That card is just absolutely powerful. There's a few cards that get around it, but it's kind of like a Covenant of Blood on steroids. You can use it as a cheap removal spell, but you can also use it to deal 10 damage to your opponent over the course of the game. I'm sad to pass a Gravedigger, but this is not a close pick, I think. Here it's going to be a Cursed Spirit. I'm never super happy to have too many of them in case I run up against a black deck or a deck with a lot of artifact creatures, but another 4 mana 3/2 is definitely not bad. Gargoyle Sentinel I like, but not in an aggressive deck like this, so that's not an option. I think Brawler's Play is just a little bit too clunky. I don't really play it usually. And the pick here is between Crippling Bite and Necrobite. Now, Necrobite works really well on my flyers if I want to make sure that I get through a card like Seraph of the Masses, but Crippling Bite is the more mana efficient option, and mana efficiency is something that this deck is currently lacking with almost no 1-drops to play. So as I've said previously, I'm very happy to run a Crippling Blight here. Looking at this Encrust, I'm not amazed. This doesn't really look like a deck that wants to encrust creatures, and also Unmake the Graves, not really what I want to be doing with this kind of strategy. I think that the pick here is Tyrant's Machine, but it's probably going to be for the sideboard against Spectral Ward or larger green creatures. Maybe large flyers as well. Oh, I was looking at this Mercurial Pretender, which is a clone and works really well with Frostlangs. You can basically keep a creature of your opponent tapped the whole time, but it's not really a rare bomb. It's just a solid limited creature. So to be honest, Carrion Crow is probably the better pick, and this because this doesn't copy opponent's creatures, and that makes a huge difference. If I had 2 Frostlings, I think it would be the Pretender, but here Carrion Crow just looks so much more efficient. Alright, this is interesting. This is actually a real decision, because Shadowclad Vampire is the best card out of this pack. Divination doesn't really fit my strategy, and Child of Night is definitely not as good as it was in previous formats, but it would be another way to lower my curve significantly. It just makes a huge difference if you can play a 2-drop before dropping your flyers on turn 3. So a start of Child of Night into Carrion Crow is so much better than a start of Sign in Blood into Carrion Crow, or even no play into Carrion Crow. So given that my plan is to win in the air but have defenses on the ground, I think Child of Night is the pick here. And it's actually possible that Black Cat would do that job even better, but I think that Crippling Blight serves a very important purpose in this kind of deck, and that is to kill early stuff, like an Elvish Mystic, or Rescue Swiftclaw, and so on, but then also to make sure that reach creatures or flying creatures aren't going to block. I'm going to take the Caustic Tar here. I don't think that I'm going to run it, but it's a card that I would board in certain matchups. Alright, looks like this concludes the draft, and we'll look at deck building very soon. Alright, this shouldn't be too difficult. Magic Online counts 17 creatures here, which is kind of what I want to have in my aggressive decks always. There's a Bloodhost in the sideboard, but that's worse than Shadowclad Vampire, and I would be surprised if there's a creature that I want to exchange for the Bloodhost. It's possible that I want to only run 16 creatures because my spell quality is quite high, whereas a card like Necromancer's Assistant is not really needed. Even the Tinkerer is not going to be amazing, but I want to play the Sacred Armory, so it's going to have a little bit of an upside. So maybe I can build a deck like this, with 16 creatures, 17 lands, making it 33, and then only 7 non-creatures in the whole deck. Now, how do I do this best? Ulcerate is definitely in the deck. I'm also always playing Stab Wound, and I want the Sacred Armory. It just fits this deck perfectly. I don't want the Unmake the Graves, and I think Caustic Tar is maybe a sideboard card, but it's kind of like a 7-drop or a 6-drop that has a delay of 1 turn, and that shows me that it's really not a card that I want to be holding in my hand for most of the time. Card I really like, by the way, is Offshade. I've had pretty good experiences with it. Even if this deck might not take full advantage of it, it's another way to use mana in the late game. I really want to play Feast on the Fallen in this deck. This just seems like the perfect deck for it. And then Feast on the Fallen is a card that allows you to run away with the game very quickly. So the problem is that I really don't have enough space for all these cards here. And it just feels wrong not to play Jace's Ingenuity, so I think that should be my other 5-drop. Maybe drawing me into Path Mages, evasive creatures, or cards to stall like a Frostlings or a Stab Wound. So that means I still have to cut 5 cards from these bottom 8, which means I only get to play 3 more. Now, Tyrant's Machine is a rather easy cut. I want to hold on to the Feast on the Fallen, as I've said. Let's see if I can make that work. I think Void Snare is probably best served as a sideboard card as well, because I have the 1 Peel from Reality, and that means I want to play the Peel. And I probably want to play a Crippling Blight. Now, that would already put me at 17. I think 1 Crippling Blight is probably the right amount, as it just serves so many important purposes. And that means I don't have the Dissipate, but I'd rather have the Jace Ingenuity, I think. This deck could make good use of a counter spell. I'm gonna be honest. Dissipate looks like a solid inclusion as well. And I'm also not sure about not playing Sign in Blood. That could just be a mistake. It could be actually better to play Sign in Blood than Jace's Ingenuity, because drawing Sign in Blood in your opener but no 2-drop makes Sign in Blood awesome. But drawing no 2-drop and Jace's Ingenuity means that you kind of have to keep a clunky hand, which isn't what this deck really wants to do. Now, in all honesty, you would probably cut the Feast on the Fallen before the bottom cards here. But overall, I've been, as I've said, quite impressed with this card. I think that I'm always happy to run it in this deck on the play, and it's okay on the draw. It's not great on the draw, but I want to also showcase this card a little bit, highlight this card a little bit, because I think it's definitely better than people make it out to be. So that means that Feast on the Fallen is going to stay in here, and yeah, that just means that Sign in Blood and Dissipate are going to leave, with Jace's Ingenuity hopefully offering a bit more than the Sign in Blood. As I've said, this could actually be a mistake, but given that my mana curve is really low, I think I'll have the luxury to cast a Jace's Ingenuity when I want to. So this should be a rather even split. Yeah, this is actually a perfectly even split. So this almost makes me think that I could get away with an 8/8 mana base, but I really need to find the 3rd land if you look at my mana curve, and that probably means that I should play an additional island. I have a double blue card, but that's not really the point. The point is that I have 3 Welkin turns, so that 3 of my 4 2-drops, 3 of my 4 creature 2-drops are blue, meaning that blue is just more important in the early game, especially because Ulcerate and Crippling Bite are not necessarily turn 1 plays. Yep, alright, let's hope we don't play against too many Forge Devils, and let's see how this goes. Add some lands. 1 more blue. 1 more blue also makes me a bit happier that the Sign in Blood is in the sideboard, but still, this is not a trivial build. Also, 17 lands is actually not too much, given that most of my creatures also have activated abilities. So yeah, I don't think I'm going to be flooding with this deck very often. Looks good. Let's see how it goes.
Do you love to play Magic Online but have a tight budget? Check out Mtgo Academy's Academy Budget Bot in the Magic Online Classifieds. All cards in stock are cheaper than one event ticket.
It's time for round 1. Let's play first and make this a bit bigger. No true drop, yeah, but still, I mean, this is not a hand that you can ever mulligan, so I'm actually happy to see this. I could be really lucky and draw into a 2-drop here, but if I don't, I'm going to curve out with the Carrion Crow into the Spirit, into Shadowcloak Vampire, and even if I miss my 4th land drop, I will have plays to make. Alright, Ulcerate I'm not going to waste on a Typhoid Reds, but maybe on a flyer that my opponent plays. I would be kind of happy to Ulcerate next turn, or this turn, rather, because I know that my mana is going to be tied up for the next couple of turns. So I'm actually going to Ulcerate this Bridemaid. It's kind of a scary card to play against anyway, if you are, I think if you're any kind of deck. White-black just has a ton of ways to gain life, and then the Bridemaid just grows out of bound very, very quickly. Now this wasn't one of the scary starts with a Pegasus or, well, the Soul Mender. Wall of Essence, well, that looks great. This plan is working out nicely. So even though I'm not drawing land, the Accursed Spirit would actually not be great because of the Typhoid Rats. And I now get to just curve out, holding back the Crippling Blight for a creature that really matters. If at some point I want to get aggressive with the Cursed Spirit, I could still Crippling Blight the Typhoid Rats, but I think it's going to be more important to be able to Crippling Blight a flyer. Yeah, this is the point where Convoke matters, but my draw and my overall strategy is not really suited to stopping all kinds of Convoke shenanigans. If I anticipate Triplicate Spirits here, I can definitely Crippling Blight to delay it for 1 turn, playing the Welkin turn instead. But then my opponent gets the Triplicate Spirits, and I have the Welkin turn, which is kind of unable to attack in a good way. Let's see if my opponent has another black creature, or if he's relying on the Typhoid Rats to hold down the ground. Okay, Shadowcloak Vampire. So that's actually interesting. The Shadowcloak Vampire is a good blocker for Carrion Crow, but not really for a Cursed Spirit. And I draw the land. So now I have a decision here. I can Crippling Blight the Typhoid Rats and hold back the Carrion Crow to block the Spirit. And then, in theory, my opponent could attack with the Shadowcloak Vampire, but takes damage from a Cursed Spirit and my flyers as a result. I could also just play my own Shadowcloak Vampire, which holds off the Spirit and maybe the Shadowcloak Vampire. But that's unclear. My opponent has the Wall of Essence, so I only really get through with the Vampire if I pay the life. I think I'm dealing more damage by playing it this way, and I'm putting my opponent into a tougher spot decision-wise. This way my opponent now has to decide whether to block with Shadowcloak Vampire or not. I mean, there could be Ephemeral Shields, which I can't do anything about. But it's not like my 5-drop is not mattering anymore. It's going to matter still. And if this is a trade, I'm happy with my decision to... play the Crippling Blight on the Typhoid Rats. It's very likely that the Cursed Spirit wouldn't have traded for a better creature. And that way I actually got a 4/3 flyer off the table. Good to know that my opponent plays an Urborg. Might be relevant. This could be a Seraph of the Masses or another Triplicate Spirits. Okay, it's actually an Endless Obedience, so Shadowcloak Vampire is back. Oh, a Zoffshade, that's interesting. But first, let's add our own vampire here. Can't attack because of the vampire. But if my opponent attacks with the vampire, then we can just trade. And down to 1 card. I think that things are actually looking quite fine here. I'm going to offer the trade with the vampire because it's the one creature that's holding me back from attacking. And if my opponent chump blocks with Wall of Essence, I'm happy. Not that, yeah, that's not really a good block, but you can see why my opponent is making it. And here, I don't really want to use the Path Mage for its ability, but it's just more mana efficient to play your non-shade creatures before you play the shade. It's also a blocker for Shadowcloak Vampire as it is, which the Zoffshade wouldn't have been. So this gives me the option of actually using the Path Mage aggressively, and that doesn't look too bad on this kind of board. I could make the Path Mage unblockable plus maybe the Welkin turn, and then I give my opponent the option to trade the Shadowcloak Vampires. Alternatively, I could just go for a 7-point unblockable attack, which puts my opponent on a bit of a better clock, but also gives him more options. Now, Zoffshade and Path Mage don't really interact too nicely together, so I'm going to try to get the Shadowcloak Vampire off the table to make sure that my later aggression is going to be more fruitful. And with this kind of line, I still have the option to draw into a 7th land, and then I can play Zoffshade and activate the Path Mage again. And if I don't draw lands, I'm also happy, because drawing more spells in this kind of even spot is going to be quite valuable. There could be a combo trick here. My opponent has 2 cards and 6 mana. It looks like it is. Maybe a Devouring Light on the Path Mage. No, it's a Necrobite. Okay. I mean, that's perfectly fine. I couldn't reasonably make all my creatures unblockable or anything. And I wasn't planning on not allowing the trade forever. If my opponent had been on 14, it would have been quite nice to attack for 7 and 7, but being on 20 means that I need 3 attacks and not a single trick from my opponent to disrupt that plan, while also not really being able to commit to defenses because I would have to use my mana every single turn. Alright, my opponent found a 7-point attack here, which is very good for him. There's no way that I can block here, so I have to go down to 7. Alright, so tables might have turned here. I have a Zoffshade, which is basically a 4/4 if I wanted, and I have the Path Mage, which can actually attack without worries here. If my opponent blocks, I have to be happy about it, because currently I'm losing the race by a fair margin. So, given that my opponent has the Marked by Honor and the Endless Obedience, it's probably best to bring in some more bounce against what my opponent is doing here. Also, Zoff Shape might not be the best, and a Curse Spirit definitely isn't. So it's going to be interesting what my opponent does here. It looks like I'm allowed to block, so I'm going to try to clear the board here. And it's possible that you noted that I tapped out of black mana with the Zoff Shade, which was just a cute little play because my opponent has an Urborg in play. So I don't know if that changed anything, but I thought it was worth it. Like, if my opponent makes the decision not to give the Shadowcloak Vampire flying because I tapped out of black, then this might induce a mistake. I'm more scared about the double block on the Spirit. I don't think I have much of a choice. Alright. That's not too bad. It's not great for me, but at least the double block seems to work out. I was just gonna say, there's a couple of cards that I would be happy to draw here. Carrying Crow, not really one of them. So given that my opponent had the Necrobite to trade off the... No, to not trade off the vampires, it might have been better to go for the 7-point swing. And the main problem here is that I'm forced to block the Shadowcloak Vampire starting next turn. Another Path Mage, so that's not bad. I think that could actually win me the game. I will attack with the Path Mage, bring my opponent down to 6. I need the Crow to block the Vampire. And we'll go down to 1 if my opponent attacks with his Crow. But otherwise, I have the win on the board with 6 points of evasive damage. Let's see if that works out. It's actually interesting if my opponent allows me to block Shadowcloak Vampire with my Amphin Path Mage. It's kind of a weird spot where if I keep both Path Mages around and assume that my opponent doesn't have an answer, I just win the game. But if my opponent allows the trade, then I could also block Crow on Crow, Path Mage on Vampire, and hope that the Path Mage gets me there. But that's not something I'm going to do here. I'm just gonna go for it. And it's very unlikely that my opponent pumps the Carrion Crow here. I mean, Sanctified Charge would kill me, I guess. But it's much more likely that my guys are not going to win me the game. If you have the win on the board, you need a very good argument not to go for it. Hey, yeah, I didn't think we were winning, but things turned out alright. I was maybe a bit too defensive with the early Ulcerate, but you can never be sure how problematic a card like the Pride Mate could be. So I think what's clear here is that we want the Faster Gloom. I've talked about this, I think, in the previous draft, actually, where the whole Velkin Faster Gloom combination is not great, but if your opponent has the triplicate spirits, then your Welcome Turns are already at their worst, so I'm happy to bring that in. And I think I also have to bring in the Dissipate. Dissipate could be great against the Necrobite, but most importantly, it's also meant as an answer to triplicate spirits. So, looking at all these kind of cards here, maybe the Void Snare as well. My opponent has shown at least one aura and tokens, so Void Snare could be a very easy way to deal with them. What I need less in this matchup is ground defense. For a card like Coral Barrier, doesn't strike me as particularly good, and Aeronaut Tinkerer probably isn't great either. Gonna take that out as well. I still have a lot of ground creatures, so I'm not unhappy to lose some creatures. This is actually something that happens quite often, I find, that you have a lot less creatures after boarding once you know what you're facing. And I guess that makes sense. In game 1, you really want to have cards that will always do something, and after boarding, it's a lot easier to know what you have to beat. Crippling Bite doesn't actually seem great against my opponent. Void Snare seems a lot better, and I'm not even sure if I want the first one here, because 1 toughness creatures aren't what my opponent showed me in this game that are going to be the problem. The problem is the amount of Shadowcloak vampires, and like the question of if there's a race and who wins it. I mean, there's Tyrant's Machine. In theory, that can be quite nice against an opponent playing auras and whatnot, but I guess a single Crippling Bite is going to do its job. There are going to be targets. I'm very sure about that. So it also synergizes nicely with Fester Gloom if you want to take out a second creature. So yeah, this is it. I'm keeping the blue extra island to make sure that my 2-drops are alive, and I'm not unhappy about the Fester Gloom at all. My opponent has mulligan. I'm looking at this hand, which I don't think is great, but which I'm going to keep. The main argument being that the dangerous cards of my opponent are 5 and 6 mana cards, and that the cheap cards don't really matter all that much. So I'm rather sure that I'll have some time on my hands to make sure that I'm not losing the game. And the number of relevant cards is actually very limited. Also, I've commented on the fact that I don't think that my deck is prone to flooding. So even with a high number of lands in my starting hand, it's very likely that I draw cards like this, which actually make it very difficult to flood. There's one problem with the Sacred Armory, and that is the fact that Dissipate is going to be tough to play. So I didn't board out Feast on the Fallen on the draw against this deck, which might have been a mistake. On the other hand, it could be very good here. I'm also quite fortunate, of course, with the fact that my opponent is stuck on lands here. I'm running into an Ulcerate by my opponent, but of course I'm casting the Feast on the Fallen. I mean, that's just too good to pass up on. But giving me a 3/3 already, and I only need to worry about, what's it called, Pillar of Light starting next turn, but then I'll have the Dissipate up, which is kind of awkward with Sacred Armory because you kind of tell your opponent that you have it. But if my opponent doesn't find a Plains here, okay, there it is. I wouldn't even have to worry about that. Necrogen Scutter, alright. That's a good one. Oh, my opponent lost life. Well, sorry about that. I guess I'm getting my 4/4 anyway. That was very fortunate. Necrogen Scutter interacting with Feast on the Fallen for the double counter. Quite unfortunate for my opponent. Now I think I will just hold up the Dissipate and also make my Child of Night a 3/2. It still trades for Typhoid Rats, but I get an additional point of life. And my opponent is pretty much unable to block the Carrion Crow, especially because I have Dissipate up. Hexproof, Sly Blade. Yeah, I'm gonna let that resolve. I mean, that's not really a card that matters. Now I could actually Stab Wound, and that also interacts very nicely with Feast on the Fallen. The problem is if I Stab Wound the Necrogen Scutter, it's just going to block immediately, pretty much. It could Stab Wound the Typhoid Rats to also be able to attack with Child of Night. My opponent then probably just blocks with the Sly Blade, but that at least makes... Yeah, I like that play, and that's because it makes Triplicate Spirits a much more expensive card for my opponent, which is one of the few ways that I could see losing this game, if my opponent goes Plains into a Convoke powered Triplicate Spirits and then some more. So once again, I won't be able to use the Sacred Armory. And I won't be using the sweet combo of Feast on the Fallen with Stab Wound, because I didn't want to put it on my opponent's flyer that would have just been able to block. If my opponent has the Triplicate Spirits, which is definitely a possibility, then blocking with the Slybait is actually quite costly here. But not blocking is also almost impossible. Taking 7 and giving me another Feast on the Fallen trigger seems almost suicidal. Alright, no blocks. Alright, yeah. That's good. I clearly don't pump here. I'm getting 2 lethal creatures. And I have the Dissipate up to protect them. Did my opponent F6? It almost looked like that. It's probably... No, just going to the end step. Interesting. So... Alright, concession. I don't know what happened there in the last turn. Maybe my opponent just wanted to top deck a land for... Maybe that Triplicate Spirits, maybe it didn't get there. Yeah, that was a bit anticlimactic, but at least I got to showcase Feast of the Fallen with some help of Necrogen Scudder by my opponent. That was not too difficult. Let's see if we can win round 2 as well.
If you'd like to purchase Magic Online cards with event tickets while logged in on Magic Online, look at Mtgo Academy's selection by trading our official bot, Academy Sellbot. You can find it in the Magic Online trading area or add it to your buddy list.
Welcome back to round 2. My opponent on the play bought mulligans to 6. And this hand looks great. I just need to draw a swamp and then everything is fine. So... if I draw an island, I have the Mercular Continent 3, which is a fine start, and then I can still draw into a swamp. If I don't draw any land, I only have the Vulcan turn, but you can't really prepare for this scenario. And after some draws, I should at least find a land. And actually, the Feast on the Fallen draw has a lot of potential as well. Runeclaw Bear. No lands so far. Yeah, I'm never going to mulligan a hand like this. Not with 2 lands, a 2-drop, and 4 3-drops. In a deck that really only wants to draw 3 lands to cast most of its spells. There we go. So I think my best line here is probably to cast the Murklurker, but I'm not sure yet. So it's just quite dangerous to cast Feast on the Fallen if my opponent has anything here. Aren't too many cards I can think of, but getting onto the board seems a lot more viable here. Could also play the Coral Barrier, to be honest. I have a blocker for Runeclaw Bear, and it's not super likely that the Murklurker will be attacking anytime soon. It seems that it's going to be more important for its ability. Given that I have a lifelinker in hand, it could also be better to just raise a little bit by applying a Carrion Crow this turn, which is kind of awkward later because it comes to play tapped. Yeah, I kind of like that. So actually Carrion Crow would have been the natural play. I just wasn't sure if the Runeclaw Bear changes that. If my opponent had a 3-drop, then I probably couldn't afford to play Carrion Crow here. But going down to 16 while putting another flyer onto the battlefield is definitely worth it. Looks like my opponent is not doing anything. So at some point I'll have to be aware of either spouts. There's also the Quickling that could block these creatures here. Playing around either spouts is kind of complicated with my hand. I mean, could also be a Dissipate, so that my opponent maybe has a counter magic for what I'm trying to do here. That is an argument to just play a Coral Barrier not to take any more damage. It doesn't give me a good plan against either spouts, though. I will probably have to just attack with 1 creature if that's the case. So I'm going to go with Coral Barrier. I think it's the best choice to give me a little bit of everything. If it's in play, I have an Evasive Threat, which is good with Feast on the Fallen. And I have a blocker for Runeclaw Bear. If my opponent wants to do things like cast, Hunt the Weak, I'm actually going to be happy that it hit the Coral Barrier, not something else, and so on. Alright, another land. I've been quite fortunate with the land draws. No complaints there. And now the squid gets to attack because of Island Walk. So actually the fact that my opponent cast a Netcaster Spider made it quite valuable to have the Island Walker in play now. It almost seems like my opponent is deciding whether to cast something like Appeal from Reality on this Island Walker. And this seems like a good time to cast Feast on the Fallen. I want the Zoff Shade in play at some point, but with the unblockable creature in play already, making my Welcome Turn large enough to attack into the spider and to threaten more evasive damage is pretty awesome. And my squid is already a great creature. I don't need to pump it to expose it to bounce spells or cards like that. Convoke, 5/5 worm, potentially. Yep, there's the siege worm. Not scared of the siege worm. I have the Murklurker for lifelink. So 6 mana now. I'm really curious if the Welcome Turn is going to get blocked, and my plan is to make the Carrion Crow a 3/3. Now with this kind of hand, I'm still much better off developing my board. I'm a bit weaker now to Hunt the Weak or Gather Courage for what it's worth, but I can still easily raise the Siege Worm if I get the Murklurker down. And I definitely don't have to do it this turn. So is this a Gather Courage? That would be very interesting. No, it's not. So that's actually great for me. What I could do here is put the +1/+1 counter on the Murklurker itself. That way I have an attacker that is most likely going to be able to get through, but also a creature that's going to be able to block the Siege Worm very soon. And of course it runs into tricks, but that's pretty much true for any of my creatures. So now if my opponent plays another spider, then it might have been a mistake to put this on the Murklurker. And if my opponent had held up 5 mana here, representing either spouts, then I would have had to be very conservative with my next attack step. Given that there's a research assistant now, I don't have to be concerned. Well, I don't have to be too concerned. Alright, some more lands. This is an attack for 5, and the Murklurker could also attack, which definitely makes the clock better. Now I still don't think that I'm anywhere close to dying here. Yeah, I think I like this. Just getting in there, making it very difficult for my opponent to block, and potentially giving more lifelink also. There is a chance that the Murklurker is going to be the target of a bounce spell, so I kind of have to be careful what I want to activate with the lifelink ability. I think that if the Murklurker just kills the Runeclaw Bear here, I'm already happy, but I do want a bit of lifelink, so I'm going to try this on the Crow. There's no real need to try for too much here. I even have a bunch of chump blockers. Yeah, so this is Peel from Reality targeting the Carrion Crow that I gave lifelink, and the Murkloker is also not gaining me any life, but that means that now I can gain more life from the other crow and get to replay my flyer, which is still better than playing the Zoff Shade, which is just my last play basically. Alright, aggressive main phase research assistant. I can just assume that my opponent is digging for answers here. One of my opponent's cards is a Runeclaw Bear. And if the Seatram attacks here, then Runeclaw Bear has to chump block again, but then the lifelink is super relevant and can't be stopped. So I might actually have stopped the Seatram from attacking here. Looks like that's the case. But that means that my opponent needs a Hornet Queen, and I'm not even sure if that's enough. I also have 2 Amphin Path Mages to draw into. Opponent down to 4, I'll play my last card, which is a Zoff Shade. And now to diversify further, I'm pumping up my Squid token. Just in case my opponent really has a bomb like Hornet Queen, I really want the Squid. So my opponent conceding here probably means that he doesn't have either spouts. Well, at least didn't have either spouts in hand. So, bit of a cheaper, no, not cheaper, bit of a more late game oriented deck I'm playing against. I could bring in Tyrant's Machine, which is kind of nice against Siege Worm, but also works against Netcaster Spider if it has to. Caustic Tar is a card that's always interesting against these kind of decks that want to stabilize and win the game that way. I don't think I need any of the other cards. Unmake the Graves doesn't seem worth it against a blue-green deck. It's just very unlikely that your creatures go to the graveyard, and Blood Host is really bad. So I think these are my non-creature sideboarding options. And the only question is if there's cards that I'm not super happy about in the main deck. I guess that Aeronaut Tinkerer once again could be a card to board out. Coral Barrier I like because my opponent is playing Islands and pretty much won me the game, so that's an easy inclusion. I want all the flyers, and I like the Crippling Blight against the Netcaster Spider. Sacred Armory also acts as an answer to Netcaster Spider, but some of these other cards here are probably a better fit than the Armory. If I take out the Armory, I also want to take out the Tinkerer, and then maybe 2 of these cards here. Bounce doesn't seem amazing, but Dissipate and maybe one of the others. I guess if I bring in the Tyrant's Machine, you could make a case for keeping in the Tinkerer, but what my opponent has shown me is not really an aggressive blue-green deck or anything, so I think I can do without the 2/3 flyer or 2/3 defender. Alright, I like the Dissipate, also because I'm 1 game ahead and I don't know what my opponent has, so if there is an Ether Spout or if there is a Hornet Queen, I now have an answer in my deck. I also think that Tyrant's Machine is generally better than Caustic Tar. Caustic Tar would just be a solid way of punching through the last points of damage. I didn't have any trouble getting through for damage this game, so I don't think that Caustic Tar is going to be necessary. But I like the Tyrant's Machine, tapping down spiders and flyers. Or just my opponent's biggest creature. So my opponent is on the play again. This hand, it's not great, but it has a pretty clear plan, and that is to get a Path Mage down at the latest, but also to refuel with Jace's Ingenuity. And from the curve of my deck, I'm very likely to have a play until turn 3. Then the mana is perfect. I really like this hand for its potential. I don't think that you mulligan this. It's not the hand that I want to see with this kind of deck. I want to see a 2-drop and a 3-drop. Also because I have cards like Feast on the Fallen in my deck. Given the matchup, I think I'm perfectly fine keeping this. Now, if this would have been a turn 1 Elvish Mystic, then my hand would have looked a bit too clunky. I just don't think that you can expect too much from your core set limited decks. There's just a limit to what you can expect from your 40 card decks to provide, and it's so easy to lose a game because your opening hand doesn't have lands or doesn't have the right cards. So at least this hand only needed to draw into relevant cards. I don't have any issue with showing my opponent the Feast on the Fallen here. My opponent knows that it's in my deck and might now play around it in a certain sense, but I really want to use my mana, and passing the turn here representing Dissipate is not something that has a lot of value. Also, my opponent must feel pretty good with the Netcaster Spider already in play. Let's see what his follow-up is. If the follow-up forces me to block or not. Could be quite relevant. Okay, my opponent is setting himself back a turn by returning the land. I get a Coral Barrier. Now that's very interesting. So clearly next turn the Coral Barrier is even better because I have Peel from Reality mana up. On the other hand, Coral Barrier would already get me the token to start attacking, but I think that's too ambitious. I need to get the Path Mage down first, and that actually puts my opponent in a pretty tough spot because the Path Mage alone is pretty much winning me the game, but my opponent doesn't know that my hand is already very stacked and that I won't really rely on the Path Mage to get me there. The Feast on the Fallen make the Path Mage more scary, but I also have... Okay, so the Netcaster Spider grows. That's a bit of a nuisance. I was hoping to be able to deal with that a little bit more easily. And the Living Totem also blocks the Path Mage, so now I actually think I have a very easy block here. I don't think that's particularly close. I wasn't going to invest the mana to make it unblockable anyway, so... Alright, Carrion Crow a bit late to the party. Coral Barrier is guaranteed to get me through damage, and it prevents 2, while also holding up Peel from Reality. So this might be one of these games where Carrion Crow is a bit slow at first. I kind of want to just play the Peel here as soon as possible. But if the Living Totem attacks, then it's an easy block of Living Totem. Hopefully enticing my opponent to play a combat trick. That would be the perfect scenario. No combat tricks, alright. So I think I just take 3 here. It's really dangerous to run into a trick here, and depending on what my opponent plays, I might actually want to peel that. Nimbus of the Isles, yeah. I get the 3/3 Carrion Crow, so bouncing the Netcaster Spider does make the spider smaller, which is certainly relevant. I could put the counter on the Coral Barrier. The counter I get from the Squid I could put on the Coral Barrier to make it a 4 toughness creature, so then I can block the Netcaster Spider, still taking 2 from the Living Totem. But bouncing the Nimbus has advantages as well. Bouncing the Nimbus sets my opponent back a lot more in mana development. And I believe that the 3 power on the Netcaster Spider are actually not that relevant. So this should be the play here. Let's see. I can always drop the Welkin turn next turn, so there's no reason to do that first. This is working out quite nicely, I think. So now the Squid attacks. And I have the choice what to pump here. And it feels like I should already put the counter on the Carrion Crow. So that way I have something to put in front of the Nimbus of the Isles. I'm taking 3 from the Netcaster Spider, but if I put the counter on the coral barrier, I still take 2 from living totem, so it's not a big difference at all. All right, down to 9. I do need to stop the bleeding at some point. And Carrion Crow is probably the right zombie bird for the job. So this is actually quite interesting. This Crippling Blight is not looking great. I could put it on the Netcaster Spider, I guess, just to make sure that the Coral Barrier can block it, so I take less damage. Not thrilled by this, because I kind of have to put the counter on the Carrion Crow to stop all my opponent's creatures from attacking, but that makes me very susceptible to some kind of peel from reality shenanigans. And because of the peel, I don't really want to cast the Crippling Blight. It's possible that this is the turn where I should Jace's Ingenuity, because the Welkin turn has almost no board impact, because I already decided that I want to put the Feast on the Fallen trigger on the Carrion Crow. I can't reasonably play around peel, I think, or can I? I could play the Welkin turn and put the counter on the Welkin turn. That way I have a blocker from the Nimbus, and I hold off the Living Totem from attacking. I would be taking another 3 from Netcaster Spider, but that might actually be the better line. So then I think I should just cast Jace's Ingenuity. If my line is either not to cast the Welkin turn or to cast just Jace's Ingenuity, it's better to see if I can find a land drop, or maybe even something better to play. Alright, Ulcerate. That's interesting. Ulcerate makes me want to... interesting. So the peel from reality targets both creatures, so it doesn't really help to respond with a removal spell. The problem with Ulcerate is also that if I take more damage here next turn, I'm really in trouble. So yeah, I think there's still the problem of me not really being able to beat a peel from reality. If the peel bounces the totem, for example, then another one of my opponent's creatures grows as well. So I'm honestly just not beating the peel, I think. I could Ulcerate now, like Ulcerate the Nimbus, and then the peel is not as crushing as it would be otherwise. So the decision is really if I want to keep up Ulcerate for next turn or not. I have some solid blocks, but my opponent blows me out with pretty much anything. If it's bounce, I don't think I'm winning this game, but if it's a combo trick, it would be great to have the Ulcerate up. Alright, I've already debated whether to put the counter on the Carrion Crow or on the Welkin turn, and I think with the Ulcerate, it's a little bit better to hold up the Ulcerate and to put it on the Carrion Crow. That way at least I might have a shot if my opponent is holding a card like Gather Courage, and I can get a favorable combat exchange with the help of Ulcerate. Also, waiting with the Ulcerate is very dangerous. Plummet. Alright, that's awful for me. Yep, that's really bad. Is the Living Totem not attacking? That's very good for me. Because I have the Ulcerate, I can use the Ulcerate to kill the Netcaster Spider here. It was giving me trouble the whole time, and I can Ranger Skyle. All right, and I didn't really have a good blocker for it anyway. There's a Dissipate. That's pretty late. So I really want to attack with the Squid. I think I almost have to grow my Welkin turn. I'm not sure if I can survive. So what could I Crippling Blight? I could Crippling Blight the Netcaster Spider so that it only deals me 2. I almost have to chump block the Netcaster Spider though, which means that Crippling Blighting a small creature is better so that I can trade with the Squid. Then I'm kind of reliant on drawing a creature at least. That still seems the best. I don't have enough life to work with. I'm not sure where this game went wrong. My hand was certainly not fast. I talked about this in the beginning. And then I had some pretty tough decisions against my opponent's rather aggressive start. I mean, Spider into Invasive Species into the Living Totem. That was not an easy spot, I think. So if I block like this, I'm already going down to 1, which means that there isn't too much I can draw to survive. But I have my outs at least. Hornet Queen? No, just a Wolfforged Golem. I'll reveal the Dissipate here. I mean, there's still a chance that I win this by top decking. Alright, didn't work out. Alright, so the Plummet really got me there. It feels kind of bad. I was only thinking about Peel from Reality, and I thought the Ulcerate would really do it. Then my opponent also had the Ranger's Guile to blow out the Ulcerate, so everything kind of didn't work out. If I play around Plummet, then I play the Welcome turn, make it a 3-2, so that I have 2 blockers for my opponent's Nimbus. And ultimately that would have ended up being better. I just, generally, if I have the choice, I don't play around... I don't want to play around removal spells against blue-green. That's just the least likely card for them to have. Crippling Blight was really bad. I think Crippling Blight is probably a card that I should board out. My opponent hasn't shown the key cards that I really want to hit with Crippling Blight, other flyers that are low toughness or Elvish Mystics on turn 1. And I really want the Sacred Armory back into this deck. It seems better than Tyrant's Machine as well. Just to have that extra point of power to make trading with Netcaster Spider or the Nimbus of the Isle so much easier. And it's possible that I'm going back, almost back to my starting setup with the Aeronaut Tinkerer. Void Snare doesn't seem like the right card here, and my creature count was definitely a bit low in game 2. That should also give me a pretty good shot at just starting to connect with the Feast on the Fallen. Let's see. Let's play first. And an interesting hand, almost similar to a previous one, where I really need to draw land to get there, and I want to play this time. But once again, I'm keeping. And the Murklurker makes it really easy, I think, with any land helping me to cast the Murklurker. But ultimately a Swamp, of course, being the best draw. I don't think that you could keep this hand if you had 2 Swamps, which is kind of the reason why I'm running one more island. Alright, Research Assistant. Alright, my deck is very cooperative. I haven't really had an unfortunate sequence of draws yet. I've had a couple of too many hands where I had to get there, but you can't just mulligan them because you got there previously. So I think it was correct to continue trying to get there. It looks like we are. I don't want to say being rewarded, but things are looking quite nice here. I kind of want to get the Sacred Armory down to make these unblockable, but the Murklurker is also very potent. Not unblockable, but harder to block with the Netcaster Spider. The Murklurker is also a powerhouse on this board, and if I draw a land, I might actually want to deploy a Curse Spirit first, which is just a card that's very difficult for blue-green to handle. And then having a better board presence is better than dropping Sacred Armory, potentially trying to trade with a Netcaster Spider, which might not even work out because your opponent could just have a trick to punish you. So here, the Murklurker could, in theory, attack, but my opponent has 2/3 toughness creatures. It's just very likely that my opponent blocks, and this is running into a counter if my opponent has a dissipate. I haven't seen one though thus far, and I need to deploy my creatures, especially if my opponent is missing land drops. This was huge. If my opponent has a 4th land and gets to activate Research Assistant or play a 4-drop, it's a completely different game, because this just swung the race in my favor tremendously. Fifth land means that I'm going to go for Shadowcloak Vampire. I really don't want to get punished by a bounce spell, or a combat trick, or an Into the Void. If I play the Armory and try to pump and my opponent has the bounce spell and then it just somehow gets back into this game, which I can't really see happen if I just play my creatures. Now my opponent's best Into the Void is still net disadvantage. Alright, Living Totem is good. This means that I want to trade Shadowcloak Vampire for Netcaster Spider, which I kind of wanted anyway. And this is interesting. This is another good Feast on the Fallen, I think. It seems to me that I just offer the trade between Shadowcloak Vampire and Netcaster Spider, and if my opponent has a Gather Courage, then so be it. I could have played the Sacred Armory before attacking. Would have probably been the tighter play. But then my opponent can still just block with Netcaster Spider and is safe from the Armory. So the Armory is actually only relevant if my opponent had seen the Armory and still blocked with Living Totem, which doesn't make sense. So yeah, my opponent takes the damage here. I can see why, but I don't think it's a good line for my opponent to take. And I'm actually going to delay the Sacred Armory. If I'm getting through here, gaining some life and dropping the Feast on the Fallen as well, I'm just feeling very confident. So I could already diversify a bit again, but Netcaster Spider is a real powerhouse. Yeah, I'm just putting this on the Carrion Crow. I don't think that Shadowcloak Vampire is going to attack on the ground a lot more. And if a Cursed Spirit hits here, continues hitting, there's just no way I'm losing this game. So I have to prepare for a scenario where the Shadowcloak Vampire is dealt with in combat and the Cursed Spirit is dealt with some other way. Alright, my deck is just delivering and delivering and delivering. Yeah, my opponent declined this block earlier, so it could be the sign of a combat trick now. Yep, there's the Ranger Skull. Which once again I could have prevented with the Sacred Armory, but I was actually more concerned about just winning the game here with the Infant Pathmage that I drew. And once again, there is nothing really that my opponent can do against it. And now the Feast on the Fallen triggers also give me another attacker that can punch through Netcaster Spider. Apart from the fact that I just win if my opponent ever taps out and I draw land. In fact, if my opponent taps out, I might have a lethal attack already. With the Accursed Spirit and the 2 flyers and the Infant Pathmage, I think there's just not much that my opponent can do. Hunt the Weak. The Pathmage is gone. My opponent really needs that Netcaster Spider to get him there. Let's see if I draw land. No. So my opponent is on a virtual 2 and I have 2 flyers. My opponent has 1 blocker for it. That means that I'm just going to attack. And I don't think that there's anything my opponent can do about it. There are a couple of Convoke spells in this format, but none of them just deal with flyers. For no mana. Yeah, my opponent was unfortunate. All right. Made the finals with this solid but unexciting blue-black deck. See you there.